Lorie, you recently won your Supreme Court case, a massive historic case in a 6-3. What did it feel like when you heard that the ruling had come down in your favor?
Well, I would say that just ecstatic. I was with my family and we had prayed for this moment for 7 years. So ecstatic and grateful that the court stood to protect speech, not just for me, but for every American. That was a moment worthy of celebrating, and we continue to celebrate today.
Yeah, I want to get into some other elements of what life has been like, in the midst of that celebration, because I know that there are pros and cons when it comes to the reactions that people have. But your case was a really important case because for a long time now, we've been having individual battles at the state level all over the country regarding the First Amendment and whether or not bakers and photographers and graphic designers such as yourself should be mandated or forced to create something, a message against their will. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned the 7 years, you were on quite a long journey in this legal battle. What was it that led you to say, you know what, I'm going to take this challenge on and not just take it on, but I'm going to fight all the way to the end?
I'm a graphic and website designer, and from the start of my business many years ago, I've wanted one thing, and that's to create speech consistent with my convictions, and I want that for everyone. Unfortunately, the state of Colorado was censoring and compelling my speech. So after much prayer and consideration, I decided to take a stand to challenge Colorado's injustice. I know that if I want speech and free speech for myself, then I need to also defend it for others, not just today, but for future generations. So that's exactly what I did. I challenged Colorado's injustice, and after 7 very long years, the highest court in the nation affirmed that the government can't force anyone to say something they don't believe, and ultimately has corrected Colorado's injustice.
Jonathan, I want to go to you on this because one of the things that has happened is, the framing of this, it's become sort of, oh, this is a license to discriminate for Christians, to discriminate against the LGBTQ community. That's been one sort of thread that I've seen in media covering this. Can you speak about why, in your view, this would actually be a victory for everyone, not just one particular worldview?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it really was a great victory for the First Amendment, for free speech, and for all Americans for precisely this point, that it doesn't apply just to protect Lorie. It applies to the LGBT web designer. It applies to the Muslim artist, the Jewish artist. It applies to everyone. And that's exactly the point. And I'd encourage people just to read the opinion, because the opinion makes that point again and again and again, that these freedoms, if we want freedoms for ourselves, we've got to extend to others. And it was the state of Colorado that was coming in and singling out particular views and saying, you've got to express our views. And that's just wrong. So we are just so excited that this decision came out to protect everybody, regardless of their viewpoints, such as those artists that I mentioned.
One of the things, I've been covering these stories for a long time, the bakers, down the line, Lorie, we've talked before in the past, and it is interesting because many times in these cases, you will see that a lesbian-owned print shop will comment, or, other individuals will comment and say, we support people like you, Lorie, because we don't want to be compelled. So in the case of, a lesbian-owned print shop, maybe they don't want to print flyers for a church. Maybe they don't want to participate in some other ideology that isn't theirs. Jonathan, essentially under this, ruling, they would then be protected as well. I just want to affirm that.
Absolutely. And that's the great part about this ruling. It is. I mean, the free speech is so important to a flourishing society. And we live in a society where people disagree with each other, and that's okay. So what do we do with that? Well, the answer, the court said, was tolerance, not coercion. And that's what Lorie was standing up for, is that principle that we can disagree, we can voice our opinions, which is just foundational to our society.
Lorie, I want to come back to you on this, because when you take a position like this and when you have a case go to the Supreme Court, and I know this happened even beforehand, before it made its way there, this had a lot of publicity on it. There are a lot of opinions about it that are not always favorable to your worldview. What has that been like, the other side of it? You talked about celebrating, but how difficult, and what have been some of the responses on the negative side?
Well, I certainly have noticed in the last week or so just some egregious lies being spread about my case and an attempt to really distract people from the core of what this is all about, which is speech, which is guaranteed to each and every one of us. It's been a challenge, but free speech is worthy of protecting. And I'm grateful that the court has stepped in to protect not just my speech, but everyone's speech. And I'm just looking forward to the next chapter. You know, I've always worked with people from all walks of life. I have clients who identify as LGBT. I simply just want to create messages consistent with what I believe, but I want that for everyone. And the court's ruling confirms that we are all able to create speech consistent with our own beliefs on topics like marriage and other things.
Lorie, how have you navigated the, concerns about safety, those sorts of things? I would imagine that has come up in this again because this is this is historic, right? It changes things as you both have described. Or if it doesn't change things, it affirms what we knew to sort of be constitutionally true about the First Amendment and the balance with the 14th. But how have you balanced that fear, maybe of some of those negative reactions?
Well, for me, my faith plays certainly a huge part of navigating the last couple weeks. I know that when I stand to speak truth, that I will be subject to some sort of persecution. And so I step boldly. I continue to walk forward, knowing that the Lord has protected my family and I the last 7 years and will continue to do so. I have an incredible group of people who are praying for me across the country, which allows me to just have peace at the end of the evening. And ultimately, I have peace knowing that what I have stood for protects everyone, including those who have sent me vile messages or have reached out. It really has protected everyone. And so I sleep well at night knowing that we are more free this week than we were even 2 weeks ago to speak consistent with what we believe. And that's a victory for everyone.
Jonathan, just as we look at this, I think one of the big questions, a lot of the other cases, some of these cases you've worked on, you've got bakers, you've got photographers, and some of these cases are still ongoing. How does this ruling affect those cases?
Well, the ruling is going to protect a lot of these clients if they're engaged in speech. And that's the key point, that one of the arguments the opinion made was these anti-discrimination laws and the First Amendment can coexist. And they have for many years. The key is the government can't misuse these laws to force someone to say something they don't believe. And I think that's really the shocking thing that's going on here that most people don't understand. Colorado admitted, as was true, that Lorie serves everybody, regardless of who they are. She serves those in the LGBT community, but they still wanted to use its law to force her to say something that violated her core convictions. That's shocking that the government would essentially say to use an anti-discrimination law when they acknowledge that Lorie doesn't discriminate against anybody. And that just shows that the state was, engaged in coercion and censorship of particular views. So this principle is going to go protect the photographer, it's going to go protect the graphic designer, the calligrapher, and we're excited to do that. And we're excited to use it to protect people regardless of their faith, regardless of their beliefs.
Jonathan, one of the things that was sort of reported in the wake of this, there were claims that the case was built on a fake instance, a man who never really put in a request, that it was predicated on his case. And I know there's been some back and forth over that. How do you respond to some of that? Because I know, as you had said, there have been some what you would see as misconceptions around this case.
Yeah, it's just a distraction and an effort to try to delegitimize this case and not grapple with the actual arguments in the case. The Supreme Court didn't mention any request. There's no dispute that Lorie received that request. And there's no dispute that the law would effectively forbid her from even reaching out and engaging in a conversation and explaining her beliefs. So it just goes back to the point that when you can't engage with the arguments, you try to distract. And we look forward to engaging in more debates and explanations about what this case is about, what it's always been about. And it's about the freedom of all Americans to speak consistent with who they are and what they believe and with their core convictions.
So, Lorie, final question for you. And, we've talked a little bit about this in this interview, but let's say there's somebody watching or listening right now and they're saying, you know what, Lorie, you just want to discriminate against LGBTQ people. You don't really care. It was all about that. what would you say to them? You've been able to say some things I think that speak to it, but I want to give you a chance to really give an appeal to help them understand your heart.
I work with people from all walks of life, including those who identify as LGBT. I always have and I always will. This case is about speech. And when speech is involved, speech should be protected. The court's ruling affirms that the government cannot force any of us to say something we don't agree. That protects the LGBT website designer, the Democrat speechwriter, the Jewish calligrapher, the pro-life photographer. Everyone should be free to create and speak consistent with what they believe. We may have varying views on the topic of marriage, but disagreement does not equal discrimination, and we must be free to articulate and speak consistent with our beliefs if we're to live in a peaceful society. And this decision is a victory not just for me, but truly for each and every one of us.
Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time, coming on and speaking with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.